You find yourself standing on the hot desert wind of Thebes. The year is 1350 BC. The Nile glimmers under a dying sun, its waters turning to blood red in the twilight. And somewhere beyond the sandstone temples and towering pylons, a secret ceremony is about to begin. The priests call it the Night of Renewal, but the whispers in the streets dare to name it something else: the Orgy of the Gods. By daylight, Egypt presents itself as the land of order. Ma'at, the divine balance. Pharaohs appear carved in granite, eternal and serene, offering gifts to gods beneath painted ceilings. But when the stars appear, when torches burn low and the city sleeps, another Egypt emerges. A hidden Egypt. One that breathes in shadows, cloaked in incense and sweat. On this night, the chosen slip into labyrinthine corridors beneath the temple of Karnak. Doors sealed with golden bolts open only to priests, dancers, and the pharaoh himself. The air grows heavy with lotus perfume. Harps pluck in strange rhythms, and bare feet shuffle across alabaster floors polished smooth by centuries of secrecy. You imagine stepping closer, following the sound of drums. Their beats mimic the heart, slow at first, then pounding like war. At the center of the chamber lies a dais draped in crimson linen. Around it, priests chant in guttural tones, reciting hymns not meant for common ears. They call upon Hathor, goddess of pleasure, upon Osiris, lord of rebirth, and upon the serpent Apophis, chaos incarnate. The pharaoh arrives last. He wears no crown, no regalia. Only a cloak of leopard skin, a symbol of the priesthood. His eyes glitter in the torchlight, half man, half god. The women who kneel before him are not concubines, not queens, but priestesses trained for years in the arts of sacred flesh. Their bodies glisten with oils of myrrh and frankincense. Gold dust clings to their skin, turning them into living statues of divinity. And then, the ritual begins. At first it resembles a feast, goblets of wine, platters of figs, honey dripping onto tongues. But quickly the line between banquet and ceremony dissolves. The priestesses rise, circling Pharaoh, their movements choreographed like serpents weaving in and out of one another. Music grows louder, the chants more frenzied. The torches flicker until shadows themselves seem to move with hunger. Egyptians called it Heka, magic, but to your eyes it is theater of flesh. Every touch, every gasp is not merely lust but invocation. The pharaoh must become Osiris reborn, spilling his seed not as a man but as a god, ensuring fertility for the land, guaranteeing the Nile's flood, feeding Egypt's endless hunger. And yet, beneath this cosmic justification, you sense something darker. For while priests claim the ritual sustains the world, it also sustains power. Witnesses are bound to secrecy, their loyalty sealed by participation. To be chosen is both honor and trap. Once you have tasted the forbidden, you belong forever to the pharaoh's shadow. Strange history indeed. The pyramids and temples speak of glory, but hidden beneath are these whispered nights, these forbidden orgies where divinity blurred into decadence. You stand in the chamber, the air thick with incense and moans, and realize this is not a myth, it is politics. The pharaoh rules not only with armies and laws, but with spectacle. Spectacle so secret, so taboo that it binds his court tighter than chains. And as the ritual crescendos, as voices cry out to the gods, a chill runs down your spine. Because you know you are watching something you were never meant to see. A world where sex is sacrifice, where pleasure is power, and where even gods demand the price of flesh. This is only the beginning. Egypt's sands hide darker nights still, nights when pharaohs shattered taboos that would horrify even their own priests. Nights when the line between god and beast dissolved entirely. And if you dare follow deeper into these shadows, the story will only grow stranger. The night after the pharaoh's secret gathering, the city of Thebes awoke none the wiser. Merchants opened their stalls, fishermen cast their nets into the Nile, and children played in the dust. But beneath the surface, those who had walked into the hidden chambers of Karnak carried secrets carved into their very skin. They had witnessed something unspoken. And once you became part of such a ritual, there was no return to ordinary life. For the pharaoh's power did not end with soldiers and priests. It seeped into the body. It conquered through desire. Inside the temple's underground hall, the air grew heavier as the ritual deepened. The priestesses, their golden skin slick with oil, chanted hymns that mixed prayer with moan, devotion with desire. Each verse called on a god, but each movement served the man they worshipped. The pharaoh sat enthroned not on stone, but on flesh, his body lifted by kneeling attendants, as if their devotion alone elevated him into the heavens. Candles bled wax across the altar, mingling with spilled wine. Harpists played faster, their strings vibrating like a heartbeat racing toward climax. The drums thundered until walls themselves seemed alive, echoing lust into eternity. And then came the fire. At the far end of the chamber, 2 priests carried in bronze braziers filled with burning coals. They set them on either side of the dais, so the pharaoh's body glowed in firelight. The smoke rose thick, but it was not ordinary smoke. It was incense, mixed with powdered blue lotus, a flower known to open the gates of the mind, to stir visions of gods, to loosen flesh from spirit. Every inhalation was a surrender. You could see it in the eyes of the participants. Their pupils widened, their breaths quickened. The barrier between human and divine blurred. To touch Pharaoh now was not to touch a man. It was to touch Horus himself, falcon god of kingship, son of the sky. One by one, the priestesses approached the altar. Each carried a small blade of obsidian, sharp enough to draw a single drop of blood. They knelt before Pharaoh, kissed his feet, and nicked their own skin, arm, breast, thigh. A drop of red fell into a bowl of milk and honey, the ancient symbol of life and sweetness. Blood for fertility, flesh for power, desire for eternity. When the bowl was full, the high priest lifted it high, his voice rising like thunder. Osiris, reborn, Hathor, hear us. Let Egypt's womb swell with life. Let the Nile flood its banks. Let the land know abundance through this union of flesh and spirit. And Pharaoh drank. The taste of blood and honey dripped down his chin, a mingling of pain and pleasure, of death and rebirth. Those who saw it swore his eyes glowed as if fire itself had entered his veins. But there was something else, something darker. Because while the ritual was dressed in holiness, beneath it pulsed something more primal. The pharaoh did not simply play the role of a god, he consumed it. He demanded submission, and the priestesses gave it not out of devotion, but out of necessity. For to refuse the god-king was to vanish from history, buried in desert sands no one dared disturb. Some whispered later that a priestess fainted that night, her body overcome by smoke and heat. Others claimed she was dragged away, never to return. Was she sacrificed, or merely silenced? The truth dissolved into rumor. But one fact remained certain. These rituals bound Egypt tighter than chains. Every participant became complicit, every witness tainted. And in this way, Pharaoh's throne was not built of stone. It was built of secrets. When the fires dimmed, when sweat cooled on skin, the chamber fell into silence. Only the Nile outside seemed alive, whispering against its banks. The priestesses lay scattered like broken dolls, their bodies shimmering with gold dust and oil. Pharaoh rose, towering above them, not as man, but as divinity incarnate. The ritual had ended, but its echo lingered. For this was no isolated night. These orgies of power, these forbidden ceremonies were repeated year after year, reign after reign. Some pharaohs embraced them with frenzy, turning the temple into a theater of decadence. Others reshaped them into darker sacrifices, spilling not only seed and wine, but blood enough to stain the Nile red. And as the centuries passed, the stories grew stranger. Some spoke of crocodiles brought into the chamber, symbols of Sobek, god of fertility. Others swore serpents coiled around naked priestesses as they danced, their hissing breath part of the hymn. Whether truth or myth, one thing was certain. Egypt's greatness was not carved only in stone. It was also written in flesh, in lust, in rituals too dangerous to survive in daylight. And somewhere deep in the sands, hidden behind collapsed walls and unmarked doors, fragments of those nights remain. Statues eroded, inscriptions half erased, whispers of ceremonies meant never to be remembered. But here now, you have seen them, and the desert remembers everything. The desert wind carried secrets. It whistled through the crumbling corridors of temples long abandoned, where hieroglyphs still clung stubbornly to stone, refusing to fade. Travelers said that if you pressed your ear against the walls at night, you could still hear the chants, low, breathless, trembling with both fear and desire. But there was another kind of whisper, one that came not from the priests or the priestesses, but from the dead themselves. Because those who had entered Pharaoh's chamber of flesh and fire were never free. Even in death, their voices lingered, and if the walls remembered, so too did the spirits. In a hidden tomb near Saqqara, excavators once discovered something peculiar. It wasn't the usual burial of noblemen or scribes. No, this chamber was filled with skeletons of women, their bones twisted unnaturally, as if they had been bound. Jewelry still clung to their ribs, golden anklets fused to brittle bones, and scattered among them were shards of obsidian blades, broken as though from violent use. The inscriptions on the walls told no names, only fragments of prayers. Prayers to Hathor, goddess of love, prayers to Isis, mother of fertility. But there was also something else, scratches that were not hieroglyphs at all, but desperate carvings, crude marks etched by shaking hands. They read like cries, "Forgive us. He sees everything. The fire burns forever." The archaeologists wrote their findings in careful reports, but outside their professional voices they whispered to one another. These were the women of the ritual. When their beauty faded, when their usefulness waned, they were not dismissed. They were buried alive, offered not to gods, but to silence. In Thebes, the story was different. There, the priests of Amun whispered of the Chamber of Mirrors, a place below Karnak, where the pharaoh's most sacred rites were enacted. The mirrors were not glass, but polished bronze, lining the walls so that every act of flesh, every touch, every gasp, was reflected 100-fold. Imagine standing there, one body among dozens, and seeing yourself multiplied into infinity, each reflection watching, each reflection judged. The pharaoh wanted not only obedience, but the illusion of immortality, his acts stretching beyond the room, beyond the night, into endless echoes of himself. And yet, the mirrors were also said to trap souls. For reflections, the Egyptians believed, were shadows of the Ka, the life force. To shatter a mirror was to wound a soul. To perform forbidden rites within them was to stain eternity itself. When Alexander's armies later marched into Egypt, they smashed many of these bronzes. But some fragments survived, buried in temple ruins. Scholars who have touched them speak of an unease, as if their own faces shifted in the reflection, no longer entirely theirs. But the most haunting whispers came not from artifacts, but from stories that survived in families. Oral traditions, passed from grandmother to child, always at night, always with a warning not to speak too loud. They told of priestesses who, long after death, rose from the Nile mist, their eyes black with smoke, their bodies still scented of lotus and wine. They came not to bless, but to curse. Anyone who disturbed their rest was doomed to dream of the rituals, dreams so vivid that men woke sweating, their hands covered in scratches as though someone had clawed them in the night. One legend told of a farmer who unearthed a golden bracelet while plowing his field. He gave it to his wife as a gift. That same night she screamed in her sleep, whispering words in an ancient tongue she had never learned. By dawn her skin was cold and her veins black as ink. The bracelet could not be removed. It had fused into her flesh. They buried her at the edge of the desert, and no crops grew there again. The pharaohs knew. They understood that power demanded a price. To bind their people, they had to bind spirits as well. That is why the rituals were not just acts of lust, but acts of imprisonment. Each cry, each wound, each kiss soaked into stone and bone, until Egypt itself became a graveyard of whispers. And though centuries have passed, though the sands have covered temples and tombs, those whispers still rise when the wind is right. Stand too close to the ruins at night, and you may hear them. A moan that is not pleasure, a chant that is not prayer, a voice that is not alive. The dead remember, and they do not forgive. The desert sky was velvet black, pierced by 1,000 stars. Yet below, on the night of the ritual, there were other lights, flames that licked the darkness like tongues of hungry spirits. The courtyard of the hidden temple blazed with torches, each one dipped in oil scented with frankincense and blood. The air itself shimmered with heat, and the smell of burning flesh lingered beneath the perfume. It was called the Night of 1,000 Flames, a festival hidden from the eyes of ordinary Egyptians. Only the pharaoh, his closest priests and chosen companions were permitted within the sacred walls. Even scribes were forbidden. No hieroglyph was allowed to capture its truth. To write it down would have been treason, punishable by mutilation. Or worse. The chosen were led naked into the courtyard, their bodies painted in ochre and gold, their eyes lined with kohl so dark that their faces seemed almost mask-like. Each bore a small torch in one hand, while the other hand was chained to the person beside them, binding them in a living circle. The fire was not just light. To the priests, fire was both creation and destruction, a gift of Ra and a curse of Set. Every flame represented a soul, bright, flickering, and destined to burn out. When 1,000 flames burned at once, they believed, the veil between the world of the living and the underworld grew thin. The pharaoh stood in the center, his crown discarded, his body gleaming with oils that caught the torchlight. He was not a man that night, but a god walking among mortals. His voice, when it rose above the drums, carried like thunder. Tonight, Ra looks away. Tonight, Osiris opens his gates. Tonight, your flesh belongs to eternity. The rituals began with fire. Torches were passed along skin, close enough to singe hair and blister flesh. Gasps rose into the night, not all from ecstasy. Those who flinched were struck by priests with bronze rods, forced to remain still as the fire kissed their bodies. Pain was not cruelty, but offering. The gods demanded scars. And then the music shifted. The drums quickened, a heartbeat pounding against the walls of the temple. Flutes shrieked, their notes spiraling into madness. The chained circle moved as one, bodies swaying, pressed together, firelight dancing across gold and sweat. Some cried, some laughed, some screamed. All were consumed. The climax came with the sacrifice of the torchbearer. At the height of frenzy, one among the circle was chosen. Not at random, but by the pharaoh's gaze. When his eyes fixed upon you, there was no escape. The chosen was pulled to the center, their torch raised high. Priests surrounded them, chanting words that had no meaning outside that night. The torch was extinguished in their chest, driven like a spear until fire became flesh and flesh became ash. Their screams joined the music, their body collapsing as sparks rained across the courtyard. But death was not the end, for in that moment the circle howled, not in grief, but in rapture. The sacrifice's flame was believed to ignite every soul present, binding them together. What had been one body consumed now lived in 1,000. Some whispered that those who survived the night never truly left. Their shadows, it was said, burned into the walls, faint outlines visible only when the torches were relit centuries later. Archaeologists in the 19th century digging near Karnak claimed to see figures appear in the soot, figures that moved when no one watched. Others claimed the ritual fire itself never died. Travelers in the desert told of stumbling upon ruins where, against all reason, a torch still burned in a sealed chamber, its flame steady despite centuries without air. They feared to touch it, for the stories warned. Once a flame from the ritual was carried into your home, it would never go out. It would consume everything, stone, wood, flesh, until nothing remained but black smoke. And yet the pharaohs returned to the ritual year after year. For them, it was not merely spectacle, but a covenant. Fire purified, fire bound. Fire ensured that their reign extended not just across Egypt, but across the boundaries of life and death. The people never saw it. They only felt its echoes. Crops grew strangely tall after the festival. The Nile swelled as if nourished by unseen blood. But animals refused to graze near the temple walls, their eyes rolling with terror. The pharaoh ruled not because of armies or monuments, but because he alone had walked through fire and emerged untouched. He alone had the power to command the night of 1,000 flames, and those who survived it never spoke again. The Nile was more than a river. It was the artery of Egypt, a living vein that carried both life and death. It fed the crops, birthed the cities, and was said to cradle the souls of the dead as they drifted toward the afterlife. But in the shadows of its moonlit banks another secret pulsed, one not spoken of in temples or carved in stone. They were called the serpent priestesses, women chosen from noble families, but stripped of their lineage, bound to the service of gods older than Osiris, older even than Ra. The people whispered their name with fear, for they were not merely women, but embodiments of Apophis, the great serpent of chaos. The rituals of the serpent priestesses were unlike anything else in Egypt. While the pharaoh's priests chanted hymns to Ra and Thoth, these women hissed invocations to the darkness, calling on the coils of the underworld to slither into the world of men. It began at night, always under a waxing moon. The priestesses gathered by the river, their bodies painted in patterns that shimmered like scales, emerald and black beneath torchlight. Around their necks, serpents were draped like living jewelry, cobras, vipers, pythons, each chosen as a living vessel of divine venom. The Nile swelled at their call. Witnesses, those few who survived, spoke of waters rising unnaturally, waves shimmering as if stirred by unseen coils beneath the surface. Crocodiles swam closer, docile, their eyes glazed as if entranced. And in the water's reflection, some swore they saw shapes that were not their own, long bodies twisting, eyes glowing like embers, mouths filled with fangs. The orgies of the serpent priestesses were as much terror as ecstasy. Men chosen from the pharaoh's guard, women stolen from the households of nobles, even slaves plucked from markets were brought in chains to the riverbank. There, under the hiss of serpents, the priestesses shed their robes and slithered among the captives. But they did not simply embrace flesh, they consumed it. Venom, harvested from sacred serpents, was mixed with wine and poured into the mouths of the chosen. It burned like fire, clouding the mind, loosening inhibitions until screams and laughter became indistinguishable. Some writhed in pleasure, others in agony, but none could tell the difference before the end. The serpent's kiss, they called it. Lips pressed against lips, tongue against tongue, while venom was passed from priestess to victim. Ecstasy followed, then convulsions, foaming breath, collapse. Yet death was not guaranteed. Some awoke days later, their eyes yellow, their speech broken into hissing whispers, their minds fractured. They were not human anymore, but marked as children of the serpent. The pharaohs feared and adored them in equal measure, for no king, however powerful, could resist the lure of their rituals. It was said that even mighty Ramses once knelt before a serpent priestess, offering his blood as tribute so that she might bless his reign with chaos and strength. And what of the people who saw the aftermath? Fishermen claimed to find bodies drifting in the Nile, punctured by dozens of snake bites, their veins blackened as if carrying liquid fire. Some corpses had no eyes, their sockets crawling with serpents. Others were found intact, but when touched, their flesh writhed, as if something still lived beneath the skin. Archaeologists, centuries later, uncovered strange shrines along the Nile Delta, half submerged in silt and mud. Within, they found carvings of women with serpentine bodies, their tongues forked, their breasts bare, their wombs depicted as open jaws. At first, scholars dismissed them as metaphors of fertility, but deeper studies revealed something darker. Offerings of venom jaws, snake bones, and human skulls, buried together in patterns that mirrored the coils of a serpent. One papyrus fragment, hidden in the vaults of Cairo, described a ritual in chilling detail. When the moon rises and the water swells, the serpent takes her form in flesh. She coils about the man until he is no longer man but vessel. His seed spills into her mouth, his life drains into her veins, and the river carries his soul into the coils of Apophis. The serpent priestesses did not die with Egypt's fall. Legends trace them across time, whispering of their survival in secret cults along the Mediterranean. Roman soldiers feared to march near certain swamps, claiming to hear the hiss of snakes and the moans of women in the night. In medieval times, rumors spoke of witches who drank venom and bore serpents in place of children. Even today, in villages along the Nile, old women warn against swimming under the full moon. They tell of pale women with golden eyes who rise from the reeds, their voices sweet, their touch deadly. Some believe they are echoes of the serpent priestesses, immortal, waiting, watching, hungry. And so the Nile remains not only the cradle of life but the womb of death. Beneath its calm waters, the serpents still sleep, their priestesses bound in memory and myth. Yet those who dare to whisper their name know the truth. The Pharaohs ruled by stone and steel. But it was the serpent priestesses who ruled the darkness. The Egyptians honored death as much as life. To them, the tomb was not an ending, but a threshold, a passage into eternity. Yet behind the solemn hymns, the gold-lined coffins, and the sacred rites, there existed another tradition, one so profane, so drenched in blood, that it was never carved in stone nor spoken aloud by priests of Ra. They were the crimson banquets, feasts held not for the living but for the dead. It began with famine. When the Nile failed to flood, crops withered, and hunger spread across the kingdom. Desperation drove people into strange bargains, and whispers spoke of pharaohs who turned to necromancers and forbidden cults, promising abundance through sacrifices. The crimson banquet was born in that despair. Prisoners, slaves, and sometimes even nobles who displeased the court were chosen as offerings. But they were not killed outright. Instead, they were dressed in finery, perfumed as if for a feast, and seated at long tables deep within hidden chambers beneath the temples. Musicians played harps and flutes, dancers swayed, and wine was poured, thick, spiced, intoxicating. The victims were forced to drink until their senses blurred, until they laughed and sang with their captors. Then the knives came out. The ritual was precise, a single cut across the throat, the blood spilling not onto the floor but into great golden bowls. Women dressed as goddesses, Isis, Hathor, Sekhmet, dipped their hands into the warm flow, painting their breasts, their faces, their lips. The smell of iron mixed with incense filled the chamber until the air grew heavy, suffocating. The blood was not wasted. It was mixed with wine, honey, and herbs, creating a crimson elixir. Pharaohs and priests drank it as they chanted invocations to Osiris, begging for rebirth and power. Some claimed the elixir gave visions, whispers of gods, glimpses of eternity, or shadows of the dead rising to stand beside the living. But the most chilling part came after. The bodies of the slain were roasted and seasoned with spices. Flesh was carved delicately, like cuts of lamb, and laid upon golden plates. Only the pharaoh could take the first bite, chewing slowly, his eyes fixed on the flickering torches, as if daring the gods to strike him down. When none came, the others feasted. Not all who partook survived. Some convulsed within hours, blood pouring from their noses and eyes as if the dead sought vengeance. Others were driven mad, screaming of skeletal hands clawing at their skin, begging to be buried alive. Yet those who survived claimed to grow stronger, their skin radiant, their virility unmatched. their reigns long and prosperous. Legends tell of Pharaoh Akhenaten himself holding a crimson banquet in secret, drinking the blood of 30 slaves in one night. His reign was brief, cursed with plague and famine, but his worshippers claimed he glimpsed truths about the sun and stars that no mortal should know. Archaeological evidence of these feasts is scarce, for the Egyptians themselves sought to erase them. Yet a few fragments remain. In a hidden tomb discovered near Amarna, murals depict figures seated at a long table. Their faces are serene, yet their throats are painted in red streaks. Above them, a pharaoh raises a cup to the heavens, crimson liquid spilling over the rim. More chilling still was a discovery beneath the temple of Luxor, a pit filled with human bones, all scorched as if roasted, many still bearing cut marks. Among them were golden goblets stained dark, traces of iron still embedded in the pores of the metal. The question remains, were these crimson banquets truly acts of ritual, or simply the desperate cruelty of rulers seeking power through terror? Some scholars believe they were symbolic, exaggerated in stories passed down through millennia, but others whisper that the power of Egypt could not have lasted without darker rites fueling the thrones of its kings. And in the villages along the Nile, even today, people tell stories of feasts that should never be held, of shadows moving in ancient temples, of whispers that rise with the floodwaters. Old women warn their children, if you hear music by the river at night, if you smell honey and blood in the wind, do not follow, for the banquet waits, and the dead are always hungry. The Nile gave life. But in the crimson banquets, it also bore witness to the devouring of life itself. A river of blood flowed as freely as water, and from it rose kings, priests, and horrors that history dared not write. Beyond the pyramids, beyond the grand temples of Karnak and Luxor, there were places hidden from the eyes of common men. These were not carved with hieroglyphs for eternity, nor sung of by priests in hymns. They were secret, decadent sanctuaries where pharaohs indulged in pleasures so extravagant, so forbidden, that even their closest advisors dared not whisper of them aloud. They were known only as the pleasure palaces. Unlike the rigid, orderly courts where pharaohs performed rituals for the gods, these palaces existed outside of law and morality. Constructed in desert valleys or on secluded islands along the Nile, they were disguised as hunting lodges or bathhouses. But behind their gates of cedar and bronze, the air was thick with incense, the walls painted with scenes too carnal to be shown to the public. The palaces were staffed not by servants, but by priestesses and acolytes of Hathor, goddess of love, beauty, and intoxication. Their role was not to serve meals or clean chambers, but to embody desire itself. They dressed in sheer linens dyed with saffron or nothing at all, their bodies adorned with jewels that caught the torchlight. The pharaoh, when he entered, shed the weight of kingship. Here he was not a ruler but a god of flesh, and every body within the palace was his temple. The rituals of pleasure began with intoxication. Wine from Crete, beer brewed with lotus, and exotic herbs crushed into hallucinogenic pastes filled the air. The pharaoh and his companions inhaled vapors through bronze pipes, their eyes glazing as the walls themselves seemed to ripple and breathe. Then came the music. Harps strummed low, drums beat slow, flutes keened like the calls of desert birds. The rhythm intoxicated as surely as the wine, each note pulling the body toward abandon. The games that followed blurred lines between ecstasy and worship. Some nights, the pharaoh would recline on a bed of leopard skins, watching as couples were forced to perform before him, judged not for skill, but for creativity. Other nights, he demanded acts of cruelty woven into the play, binding, bloodletting, the mingling of pain and pleasure until screams became indistinguishable from moans. Priests claimed these were not mere indulgences, but sacred reenactments of the cosmic struggle between gods, Isis and Osiris, Horus and Set, life and death, pleasure and suffering. Yet beneath the holy words was only the raw hunger of flesh. The most infamous chambers were the Hall of Mirrors, a room lined with polished bronze plates, where every movement was multiplied into infinity. Pharaohs and their chosen companions would lose themselves within, watching their own reflections twist into grotesque mosaics of limbs and mouths. And then there was the chamber of the serpent, where live snakes were released among the revelers. The serpents, sacred to Wadjet, goddess of protection, slithered across bare bodies as the pharaoh demanded silence. To flinch, to scream, to move too quickly, was to invite venom. Yet those who remained still, trembling with fear and arousal, were rewarded with the pharaoh's favor. The feasts that accompanied these rituals were equally obscene. Platters of roasted fowl stuffed with figs, bread dripping with honey, bowls of pomegranates cut open to resemble bleeding hearts.
Food was not merely eaten, it was smeared across bodies, licked from skin, fed mouth to mouth until it became impossible to tell where nourishment ended and indulgence began. Legends tell of Pharaoh Ramses II constructing an entire hidden palace on an island in the Nile, reachable only by boat under cover of night.
There he is said to have kept not only concubines but captured queens from foreign lands, forced into rituals that broke both body and spirit. Some were never seen again, their names erased from history, their corpses rumored to be buried beneath the marble floors. The pleasure palaces were more than dens of excess. They were weapons of power. Pharaohs invited nobles, generals, and foreign envoys into their chambers, binding them not just with gold or threats, but with secrets. Once a man had indulged in the forbidden, once his sins had been witnessed and remembered, he could never again defy the pharaoh. Many alliances were sealed not in temples or throne rooms, but in beds drenched with wine and sweat. And yet, such power came with curses. Those who attended too often wasted away, their eyes hollow, their bodies weak, as if drained of life itself. Some were found dead in their chambers, smiles still frozen on their lips, their fingers clutching at nothing. Priests called it the price of excess. Whisperers claimed it was Hathor's revenge, punishing mortals who dared overindulge in the pleasures meant only for gods. Archaeologists centuries later uncovered traces, small rooms beneath the sands, painted with erotic scenes so explicit they shocked Victorian sensibilities. Broken goblets stained with dark residues. Bones of snakes coiled near human remains. The palaces themselves may have crumbled, but their echoes remain in every story of Egyptian decadence. For the pharaohs did not rule only with armies or monuments, but with desire. Desire enslaved more completely than chains, and the pleasure palaces were its crucible. Even now, under the moonlit Nile, travelers claim to hear faint music drifting across the waters, drums, flutes, laughter. Some swear that if you follow the sound, you will find an island where no island should be, where torchlight flickers against stone, and where unseen hands beckon you into chambers that smell of wine, blood, and incense. But none who follow ever return. Not all who indulged in Egypt's darkest pleasures were pharaohs. Some of the most dangerous and decadent rituals were whispered not in the palaces of kings, but in the hidden temples of queens. Women who ruled not only by crown, but by flesh, weaving desire into their arsenal as deftly as any general wielded an army. Among these women, none was as infamous as Queen Ankhesenamun, widow of Tutankhamun. After the boy king's death, she was left alone in a world of vipers, priests, generals, and foreign kings, all seeking to control her body, her throne, her destiny. To survive, she turned the one weapon left to her advantage: desire. Hidden in the shadows of Karnak, she built what became known only in whispers as the Temple of Desire. It was not sanctioned by priests, nor recorded in scrolls. It was a place where Ankhesenamun gathered lovers, courtiers, and even enemies, luring them into rituals that bound them to her in ways no oath of loyalty could. The temple was disguised as a shrine to Hathor, goddess of love. On the surface, it was filled with flowers, music, and dancing maidens. But beneath, in chambers carved into the bedrock, lay a labyrinth of torch-lit halls painted with scenes so carnal that even the Roman frescoes of later centuries would pale by comparison. Inside, the queen presided not as a grieving widow, but as a goddess incarnate. She wore gold chains draped across her bare skin, each chain tipped with bells that jingled when she moved. Her hair was perfumed with myrrh, her lips stained with crushed pomegranate. To those who entered, she was not mortal flesh, but Isis reborn, the embodiment of divine temptation. The rituals began with dancers, their bodies oiled until they gleamed like living statues. They performed in pairs and trios, twisting in ways that blurred the line between dance and intercourse, their movements choreographed to drive spectators into frenzy. The queen would sit upon a throne of ebony, watching, sipping from a goblet of wine mixed with opium resin. At the height of the performance, she would descend among them, choosing her partners as a predator chooses prey. Those chosen were both honored and damned, for to please the queen was ecstasy, but to fail her was to vanish from history. It was said that she demanded acts so taboo that even the most seasoned courtesans trembled. Incestuous unions reenacted the marriages of gods. Bloodletting turned passion into sacrifice, each drop smeared across her skin as an offering. Some nights, slaves were brought in and forced into spectacles too violent to speak of, their cries drowned by drums and flutes. The queen believed these rituals gave her power, not merely political but supernatural. She claimed that by uniting sex and blood, she could harness the life force of her lovers, extending her youth and beauty. Whether myth or truth, her survival in a court of predators lends weight to the legend. The temple was not just a sanctuary of indulgence, it was a web of control. Every noble who entered was marked. Their secrets, what they did, with whom, in what perverse arrangement, were carefully recorded by the queen's priestesses. Once a man gave in to temptation, he was hers forever. Defiance meant exposure, and exposure meant death by shame, long before the executioner's blade. Foreign envoys, too, were ensnared. It is whispered that even a Hittite prince, lured to Egypt by promises of marriage, was first tested in the queen's temple. What he endured there was never recorded, but he left broken, refusing her hand before being mysteriously assassinated on his journey home. But indulgence invites ruin. Whispers spread among the priesthood. They spoke of unholy rites, of a queen who desecrated the gods' laws, of orgies that turned temples into brothels. Some claimed plagues struck Thebes as divine punishment, that Nile floods failed because Ankhesenamun had corrupted the sacred order. Her enemies used these whispers to rally against her. The Temple of Desire, once her fortress, became her doom. One night, flames consumed its upper chambers, driving revelers screaming into the streets. The queen vanished into the smoke, her body never recovered. Some say she was killed by priests who could no longer tolerate her sacrilege. Others believe she escaped, fleeing into the desert with a handful of loyal followers, continuing her forbidden rites in secret sanctuaries never found. Centuries later, archaeologists discovered fragments, broken wine jars, charred bones, and faint murals depicting women with crowns reclining on naked bodies. The images were so scandalous that early researchers destroyed many of them, fearful of staining Egyptology's reputation. But a few survived. And in those images, Ankhesenamun lives on, not as a grieving queen, but as a goddess of forbidden desire, ruling not by crown or sword, but by the ancient, eternal enslavement of flesh. Even now, beneath the sands of Karnak, locals whisper of a sealed chamber, one never opened, said to hold the queen's final throne. They warn that those who break the seals will awaken her spirit, hungry, wrathful, demanding the same sacrifices she once feasted upon, a queen not of history but of hunger. But the great temples of Thebes had once echoed with chants of ecstasy, the pounding of drums and the whispered vows of flesh given to gods cloaked in gold. But now, under the weight of centuries, those same stones trembled not with pleasure, but with fear. Whispers ran through the court like a poison. The Pharaohs' orgiastic rites, once proclaimed as divine communion, had become an open wound festering in the heart of Egypt. Foreign envoys spoke in disgusted tones, their letters home filled with scandal. Priests once loyal to the throne began to mutter in secrecy, questioning whether the gods themselves had turned their faces away. It began with small rebellions, temple scribes refusing to record the ceremonies, guards averting their eyes as naked nobles paraded into sacred chambers, women weeping after being offered to the gods in the pharaoh's stead. And then, the sickness followed. Bodies weakened, and rumors spread that divine punishment had taken hold, that the Nile's fertility was poisoned by sin. The common people grew restless. The pharaoh feeds the gods with lust, but the river feeds us with nothing, they cried. Crops withered. The cattle grew thin, and as hunger spread, so too did anger. But still, the palace burned with decadence. While the streets filled with hunger and whispers of revolt, within the guarded chambers, wine flowed like blood, and flesh met flesh under the painted eyes of the gods. The pharaoh, swathed in silks, declared himself the living vessel of Osiris reborn, demanding more sacrifices of ecstasy. Yet shadows crept closer. Nobles who once reveled began to plot escape. The high priests, their faith shattered, gathered in secret chambers beneath the temples, murmuring of rebellion cloaked as piety. They would not allow the empire to be swallowed by this fever of flesh. And in the silence of the tombs, deep within the Valley of Kings, the ancestors seemed to stir. Priests spoke of strange dreams, of long-dead pharaohs, their eyes hollow, warning of wrath, of dynasties consumed not by war, but by desire unbound. The stage was set. Egypt, torn between devotion and decadence, prepared for a reckoning. The orgies that once promised immortality now whispered of ruin. The night of reckoning came like a storm. The sacred halls of Karnak, once drowned in the cries of pleasure and the burning scent of incense, now echoed with the thunder of marching feet. The high priests, robed in white, carried no chalices of wine, no symbols of fertility. They bore torches, and in their eyes blazed the fury of gods long insulted. The pharaoh reclined on his golden couch, drunk with wine and with flesh, when the doors burst open. Nobles and priestesses screamed as flames licked the silken drapes. The orgy dissolved into chaos, jewels scattered, naked bodies clawed for escape, and the once sacred altar of lust cracked beneath the weight of betrayal. Dragged from his throne of decadence, the pharaoh spat curses upon his captors. "You think the gods have abandoned me," he roared. "It is through me that they have tasted eternity. Without my flesh, Egypt is but dust." But the priests did not listen. They bound him in chains of bronze and led him into the night. Outside, the people had gathered. Faces gaunt with hunger and anger glared at the ruler who had squandered the Nile's blessings. Stones were thrown, curses spat, but the pharaoh only laughed, a deep, mad laugh that curdled the air. His sentence was not swift. For days he was paraded, his former lovers now jeering, his nobles silent in fear. And when at last he was entombed alive in a chamber carved hastily beneath the sand, his voice echoed against the stone. "I am Osiris reborn. You cannot bury the eternal. My seed is in the blood of your children, my breath in the river's flow. You may seal this tomb, but Egypt shall forever hunger for what I have given." They sealed the chamber. Silence fell. Yet the curse remained. Generations later, when plagues swept the land, when the Nile ran low, when dynasties crumbled one by one, whispers returned that the pharaoh of forbidden orgies still writhed in his tomb, his lust seeping into the veins of Egypt like a poison. Explorers centuries later would uncover fragments, murals of writhing bodies, inscriptions half erased, warnings etched in trembling hands. Do not awaken the pharaoh. Do not speak his name, for his desire is eternal. And so the tale of Egypt's most forbidden ruler passed into shadow, half history, half nightmare. A story of a throne drowned in pleasure, of a legacy stained not with glory, but with blood, lust, and an unending curse that no sandstorm could erase.